Hi everyone. Today we're going to investigate not just the future of clinical research, but why drugs are so expensive. Everybody knows that drugs that come to market nowadays are extremely expensive. It's in the news and affects many of us around each other. But what's the reason for this? Is it because the drug companies are just greedy and they're taking advantage of these poor sick people, like sometimes the media paints the picture as? Or is it really that the costs are so astronomically high to develop these medications that the only way the pharma companies can recoup the cost of R&D is to charge high prices? So we're going to start with an overview and dig into details as we go along. Clinical studies have become more and more complex, convoluted, and ultimately expensive. We really need to streamline them by using technology and innovative approaches so that we can make them more efficient without sacrificing patient safety and data accuracy. The high cost of clinical trials affects not only the pharma companies, it also affects the patients. This is because high R&D costs translate to astronomically high drug costs, meaning that many patients can't really afford the treatments by the time they make it to market. A little about myself. I'm a monitor who's worked at multiple global CROs over the course of about 10 years. I have a unique perspective for this research because I'm embedded in the whole process and work hands-on with the research personnel, the coordinators, the nurses, the doctors on a daily basis all across the country. So before I dive right into the technical complexities and conundrums of today's clinical research industry, I think it'd be a good idea to start from the basics and work my way up. So we'll take a look at the beginning of clinical trials, its evolution into modern-day research, and then the concerns for the future. The reason clinical trials were first conducted is pretty obvious. It's to know that the treatments actually worked. It also was looking at safety, but that actually came much later after efficacy. So before the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, it was actually legal for companies and salesmen to promote unsubstantiated claims, such as snake oil curing all diseases. So in search of validation of claims, people began experimenting. And one of the earliest examples is smallpox inoculations in the early 1700s. And during this time, prisoners were inoculated by having smallpox scabs rubbed into scratches made in their skin. And the patients would develop symptoms identical to those created by the naturally occurring smallpox, but it would have a less severe outcome of the disease. So these were really observational studies more than controlled comparative clinical studies. So one of the first controlled clinical trials was done in the mid-1700s by a British doctor named James Lind. In response to about 3/4 of every ship's crew dying during long voyages from scurvy, he sought out to pinpoint an effective cure. So he tested popular suggested cures on sailors with scurvy at the next voyage, and he broke them into different treatment groups. And they were given daily allotments of, some were given cider, some were given elixirs and various mixtures, some were given seawater, some were given vinegar, and the 5th treatment group were given oranges and lemons. And by comparing the different groups, he was able to determine that citrus fruit was the most effective treatment for scurvy. Though James Lind's famous scurvy trials were done in the mid-1700s, modern-day clinical research really didn't become into existence until centuries later. For example, placebos weren't used until the mid-1800s. Randomization wasn't used until 1900s. Study blinds weren't utilized until 1920. And multiple sites were not used in research trials until about 1940. So there were advancements in clinical research practices in the early 1900s, but there were also major setbacks, and one of which is the Tuskegee syphilis study. So in this study, hundreds of African American men with syphilis were followed with physical assessments and checkups, but were deliberately not treated. And the purpose of the study was to look at the progression of untreated syphilis. Penicillin became the accepted treatment for this disease in 1945, Yet these studies still persisted until approximately 30 years later. The syphilis studies, however, still paled in comparison to the Nazi experiments. During these experiments, during the Holocaust, Nazis conducted unimaginable experiments on Jewish people, such as infecting them with malaria and then testing out different cures on them, infecting them with horrible burns and injuries, such as those caused by mustard gas, and then testing different treatments on them. They would even test the effects of poison bullets, and so all horrible things that were more like torturous experiments than proper clinical trials. So the disasters of Tuskegee and the Nazi experiments were not the only setbacks in the world of clinical trials. In the 1950s, thalidomide was used to treat morning sickness in pregnant women. It was even approved as an over-the-counter drug in Western Germany. But it was later found to be responsible for approximately 10,000 birth deformities, most prominently these flipper-like limbs that you see in the picture. Sulfanilamide was a drug that was used for fighting bacterial infections in the 1930s. And since it was bitter and hard for children to swallow, it was combined with a solvent that allowed it to mix with a flavored syrup, effectively masking the taste. The solvent, which was diethylene glycol, was effectively antifreeze and led to dozens of deaths, many of whom were children. So the aforementioned tragedies led to some major reforms. Listed here are just a few notable acts that were passed by legislative committees. For example, prior to the elixir of sulfanilamide disaster, the law at the time, which was the Food and Drug Act of 1906, allowed for a company to sell a drug without showing that it was safe. So after the sulfanilamide tragedy, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 was passed, requiring that companies show evidence of safety before the product could be marketed. So there were some great reforms passed within the last century, helping protect the general public. Unfortunately, however, more pharmaceutical disasters would be on the horizon. One of the most infamous examples is the recall of fen-phen, which was a diet drug made by Wyeth in 1997, it was recalled. It was very popular in the 90s. It was taken by approximately 6 million people. But it caused heart disease and pulmonary problems, and like I said, it was recalled in 1997 after millions of people had already taken it. Posicor was a treatment developed for hypertension by Roche. It was found to be deadly when combined with up to 25 different drugs. Many of the drugs were common antibiotics, and this led to drug-drug interactions and ultimately death. Resolin was an anti-diabetic and anti-inflammatory drug, which was later linked to hepatitis, also resulting in death. Vioxx was created by Merck and was used to treat arthritis and menstrual pain, and was approved for use in 1999 by the FDA. This infamous painkiller was linked to up to 38,000 heart attack and stroke-related deaths, and up to 160,000 injuries. And by the time it was pulled off the market by the FDA in 2004, about 25 million Americans had already taken the drug. Bextra was created by Pfizer and was an NSAID used to treat arthritis and pain. And like Vioxx, it caused an increased risk of heart attack and stroke. But it was less publicized than Vioxx. However, it still led to about $2 billion worth of settlements. So these medications led to people criticizing the FDA for hastily approving medications before testing them out thoroughly enough. So in response to these protests and public anger, the FDA developed stringent, ultra-thorough testing regulations. To highlight this point, a study in 2012 concluded that the FDA has not approved any weight loss control drugs in over a decade, despite obesity being a leading cause of death in America. For instance, in 2010, the FDA rejected a weight loss drug called Lorcus, which the pharmaceutical company they decided the pharmaceutical company had not ruled out the possibility that Lorcus could cause heart valve disease. And shortly after, another anti-obesity drug was rejected by the FDA that cited more long-term studies were needed to confirm the drug didn't cause an increased risk of heart attack. So here we have examples of the FDA requiring evidence of absence. So even if a certain adverse effect is not showing up during clinical trials, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to get approval. So that's a brief glimpse of the beginning of clinical trials and the paths that led us to where we are today, which is the distrust in the pharmaceutical companies, distrust in the FDA, and the treatments that drug companies come out with. So some of the signs and symptoms of the result of distrust is the call for more exhaustive and extensive testing so that more drugs don't make it to market that just need to be recalled later on. And basically what we have is a requirement that more R&D is done, which leads to increased costs when the drugs finally make it to market. Another big reason for the increased cost of R&D nowadays is the explosion of technology. Simply put, this is because we are now capable of infinite layers of tests, analysis, and analytics. And this has resulted in higher R&D costs. So, for example, let's look at something seemingly simple like IP. Investigational product is distributed by one vendor. The distributions are triggered by another vendor, IVRS. Expiration date memos can be sent out by even a third party, which could be the CRO. There's temperature excursions that happen. There's resupply, tracking, documentation issues that need to be resolved. And something simple like IP is now becoming quite complicated. You also have the classic example of too many parties and managers involved, convoluting things instead of making things more simple. So, for example, many studies now have multiple clinical research or clinical trial managers. You have a manager that's dedicated to startup, a manager that's dedicated to transitions, a manager that's dedicated to closeouts. You have siloed departments. You have data management versus clinical versus safety. And you also have disconnects between the people making the decisions at the top, and the managers, and the people on the ground, the coordinators and the monitors. Vendors, the number of vendors in clinical trials is another huge factor for the high costs. So, as you can see here, I've just listed a few examples of different types of vendors in a clinical trial, and the number has just exploded over the last few years. There's now third parties that provide everything from CTMS, EDC services, ePro, which is electronic patient-reported outcomes, such as eDiaries. There's patient reimbursement services or subject recruitment services, and there's also services that collect and analyze data for protocol-specific procedures, such as EKGs or pulmonary function tests. So it's gotten much more complicated and costly. So as exemplified from the last slide, less is sometimes more. However, studies aren't just about safety and efficacy anymore. They're looking at pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic, genomics, secondary, tertiary effects. They're looking at long-term effects, delivery analysis, let's say vials versus pre-filled syringes. They're looking at proving absence of effects. Another example would be something straightforward like protocol deviations. These are now sometimes really confusing. For instance, are they captured in EDC? Are they captured in CTMS? They need to be coded, categorized. They need to be reported to IRBs, reported to sponsors, and all of these actions need to be tracked. The same thing goes for adverse events. There's many different levels. There's AEs, AESIs, which are AEs of special interest. There's SAEs, and the more levels, the more costs. And we'll continue this on part 2 of our presentation.